The Lancaster bomber trembled as it skimmed below 200 feet, the Ruhr Valley's chimneys now looming above rather than below. Flight Lieutenant John Nettleton tightened his grip on the controls, eyes fixed on the altimeter needle hovering perilously near zero while his navigator barked course corrections through the intercom that IT was April 17, 1942. 12 Avro Lancasters thundered toward the manned diesel engine works at Augsburg, at an altitude most pilots would only attempt in a crash landing. What unfolded over the next 40 minutes would scar Bomber Command for months and, paradoxically, inspire one of the war's boldest tactical reinventions. The Augsburg raid had never been meant as a death sentence. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris approved the daylight low-level assault after reports confirmed the factory supplied half of Germany's U-boat diesel engines. Conventional high-altitude bombing had been abysmal. Barely 5% of bombs in 1941 hit within 5 miles of their target, a humiliation the Air Ministry tried to bury. Someone at High Wycombe proposed a daring solution: fly below heavy flak range to improve accuracy and survival odds. They were disastrously wrong about the latter. Of the 12 Lancasters leaving RAF Waddington that morning, only 5 would make it home. Over France, German fighters pounced. The bombers, stripped of altitude and defensive advantage, were easy prey for Messerschmitt Bf-109s diving from above. Squadron leader Sherwood's plane disintegrated over the channel. Flight Sergeant Beckett's aircraft spiraled into a French hillside after cannon shells ripped through the fuselage. By the time Nettleton's battered group reached Augsburg, half the force was gone, and the target's light flak guns were waiting. The attack lasted barely 7 minutes. The survivors tore across the factory roofs at 250 miles per hour, bomb aimers releasing their payload from scarcely 100 feet as tracer fire clawed through the night. Warrant Officer Crumb's Lancaster was shredded, rolling inverted into the workshops below. The explosions were immense. Reconnaissance later confirmed major structural damage, but the cost was unbearable. Nettleton coaxed his riddled bomber back to England and was awarded the Victoria Cross, though he'd fall over Turin a year later. For Bomber Command, Augsburg forced a reckoning. A 58% loss rate was militarily impossible to sustain. Harris conceded the raid had been too costly and suspended further daylight low-level strikes. The Americans, observing closely, drew opposite conclusions, doubling down on high-altitude daylight precision raids with their fortress-like B-17s. Yet within the carnage lay a revelation. Surviving crews reported a strange phenomenon. The dreaded 88mm heavy flak batteries had done almost nothing. Their shells, fuse and detonate above 15,000 feet, passed harmlessly overhead while the Lancasters hugged the ground. Losses came from fighters and light guns, not radar-guided heavy flak. The finding was filed away as a curious footnote, forgotten amid the grief. But war breeds innovation. By early 1943, Harris's night raid was suffering catastrophic losses to German radar and night fighters, and daylight operations remained suicidal. Somewhere in that desperation, a radical insight emerged. Perhaps Augsburg hadn't failed because of its altitude, but because of its timing and exposure. What if low-level flight, used with stealth at night, could be transformed from folly to weapon? Radar physics hadn't changed, but Bomber Command's understanding had. German Wurzburg and Freya systems formed a vast detection fence, tracking bombers over 80 miles out, but radar beams traveled straight, and Earth's curvature created a deadly blind zone. Below 300 feet the shadow widened. Below 100 feet, aircraft vanished entirely. Wing Commander Guy Gibson realized this in training over the Wash in January 1943. His crews flew lower each night, and ground spotters could still see them, but radar operators could not. The discovery was simple yet revolutionary. Germany's formidable air defense had a hole at the horizon, and Bomber Command was about to fly straight through it. The detection network that had already cost Britain thousands of aircrew could be defeated not by electronic jamming or elaborate decoys, but by sheer proximity to the ground. The tactical payoff multiplied once Gibson's team ran the numbers. Heavy flak batteries required 3 elements to function: early warning from radar, time to compute firing solutions, and sufficient altitude for their shells to arm. Remove the first element, and the other 2 lost meaning. Germany's premier heavy anti-aircraft weapon, the Flak 41, needed its shells to travel roughly 1,500 feet before the time delay fuse armed the charge, a safety measure to stop premature detonations that might kill the gun crews. Bombers hugging 100 feet flew beneath that arming threshold, effectively turning the weapon into little more than a throwing stone. Light flak presented a different problem. Rapid-fire 20mm and 37mm guns could certainly bring down aircraft at low level. Augsburg had proved that in the cruelest terms, but their lethality depended on visual acquisition and manual tracking. In darkness or poor weather, manually aimed batteries became speculative. Tracers sprayed toward the sound of an engine, hoping for luck. And light flak coverage was necessarily limited. Germany could not surround every factory, rail yard, or canal lock with quad 20mm emplacements. The Reich's defensive design relied on radar-directed heavy flak for broad area coverage and concentrated light flak around truly critical points. Bomber Command's Operational Research Section crunched the figures through February 1943, and the results were startling. A Lancaster flying at 100 feet at night over relatively undefended terrain faced roughly 1/15 the risk of loss that the same aircraft would face at 15,000 feet over the identical route. The lethal triangle, searchlights, radar-guided heavy flak, and night fighters that was eating into Harris's force ceased to function against attackers the defenders could not see coming. That advantage, however, came with savage operational costs. Navigation at 100 feet in darkness was fiendishly hard. Map reading became useless. Landmarks flashed by faster than a navigator could identify them. Radio aids like G had limited precision at low altitude. Pilots had to fly by instruments while scanning for terrain, a mental workload that induced exhaustion within an hour. The margin for error shrank to microscopic proportions. A single distraction, a slight miscalculation, and 7 men could die in an instant as their bomber slammed into the earth at 230 miles per hour. Flight Lieutenant Les Munro, who survived the war to become one of New Zealand's most decorated airmen, called low-level night flying controlled madness. The altimeter became scripture. You watch it more than the horizon, counting feet like a drowning man counts breaths. The aircraft shadow, when moonlight allowed, became a secondary reference. Too close and you hit something, too high and you climb back into radar detection. Munro remembered skimming so low over Dutch fields that the Lancasters slipstream blue water from flooded meadows, spraying a phosphorescent mist into the night. Throughout March 1943, the IAF ran deliberate trials, flying Lancasters at measured heights past German radar stations to pinpoint detection thresholds. Intelligence officers questioned escaped prisoners and resistance contacts to learn German flak doctrine. From those experiments emerged a doctrine: carefully selected targets, detailed route planning to exploit radar gaps, intense crew training, and an acceptance that low-level tactics were a precision tool, not a universal cure. Low flying was a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Gibson's telephone rang at 3 on a gray February afternoon in 1943, and he was summoned to Bomber Command headquarters. What followed in Harris's office sounded almost lunatic. 3 dams in a Ruhr Valley holding back billions of gallons of water that powered German industry, and a weapon that would skip across reservoirs like a stone, strike the dam face, and detonate at a calibrated depth. Barnes Wallace, the aviation engineer famed for his invention work on the Wellington and later ideas for long-range ordnance, had spent months developing what he termed the upkeep mine. Conventional bombs either bounced off dam walls or sank too far from them to cause catastrophic damage. Wallace's solution was elegant and terrifying in equal measure. A 9,250-pound cylindrical drum would be spun backward at high RPM before release so that it skipped across the water, overcame anti-torpedo nets, and rolled down the dam face until hydrostatic pressure held it against the wall. Its fuse would detonate at about 30 feet depth, directing the blast inward into the structure rather than dissipating it in open water. In scale, models of physics worked perfectly. Translating that into a night operation with 4-engine Lancasters was another matter entirely. The weapon had to be released at exactly 60 feet above the water, at precisely 240 miles per hour, from a distance of 425 yards. 10 feet too high and the drum would shatter on impact, 5 miles per hour too fast and it would skip clean over the wall, 20 yards too close and the bomber risked being caught in its own explosion. Gibson's crews had roughly 6 weeks to master techniques that ran counter to every instinct drilled into them. Number 617 Squadron began training over the Aibruch Reservoir on March 31, 1943. Lancaster bomb bay doors were removed to accept the cylindrical device and 2 spotlights were fitted, one in the nose, one in the belly, angled to converge at 60 feet. When the two beams merged into a single circle on the water, the pilot knew his height was correct. Navigation aids could not reliably mark the 425-yard release point, so crews improvised with remarkably crude but brutally effective visual cues and timing drills. The solution was brilliantly simple, a wooden triangle fitted with nails at precise angles. When the bomb aimer aligned the nails with the dam's towers, the range was exact. Training for this technique was relentless and sometimes fatal. Flight Lieutenant Hopgood's crew misjudged their height over the Derwent Reservoir and slammed into the water at 200 miles per hour, the aircraft disintegrating instantly. Yet survivors became masters of what one called dancing with death at arm's length. They learned to read the water's texture in moonlight, to distinguish the darker sheen of deep reservoirs from the silvered ripple of shallows, to calculate drift and approach angles by instinct while their aircraft thundered toward concrete walls. The raid launched on the night of May 16, 1943, 19 Lancasters departing RAF Scampton in 3 waves. Gibson led the first, crossing the North Sea at 100 feet, weaving through corridors of flak positions charted by intelligence. Over the edge, Selma, Pilot Officer Rice's bomber, clipped the surface and cartwheeled into a column of spray and flame. Flight Sergeant Barlow struck high-tension cables in Germany and exploded. By the time Gibson reached the Moan Dam near midnight, his formation was already blooded. What unfolded next would enter legend. Gibson's Lancaster made the first run, lit up by searchlights and tracer fire as a rotating upkeep mine skipped 3 times and detonated at the wall's base. The structure held. Hopgood's turn ended in disaster, his aircraft shredded by flak, bomb falling wide, the wreck of Fireball beyond the dam. Martin followed, striking cleanly but again without result. Then Young, then Maltby, each impact chipping away at the dam's strength. At 12:49 a.m., the Moan Dam gave way. A wall of water 30 feet high burst through the breach, obliterating villages downstream. Gibson radioed the prearranged code word, his dog's name, confirming success. The surviving bombers turned south for the Eder Dam. Gibson, his bomb expended, led decoy passes through withering gunfire while Shannon and Maudslay pressed home their attacks. At 1:52 a.m., the Eder 2 was breached, unleashing another tidal surge. The cost was terrible, 8 Lancasters lost, 53 men killed. But the strategic and psychological effects were enormous. The floods wrecked hydroelectric plants, drowned armament works, fouled reservoirs, and forced the Germans to divert thousands of laborers to repair the damage. Within days, photographs of the shattered dam circled the globe, proof that precision low-level bombing could succeed where thousands of high-altitude sorties had failed. The new doctrine was written in blood. Low-level training became a litany of near-death experiences. Pilots expecting advanced bombing instruction instead found themselves practicing high-speed Con-2 flying in machines never built for it. The Lancaster's 102-foot wingspan was wider than most English streets, at 100 feet altitude, that left only 50 feet of clearance before a wingtip met disaster. At 230 miles per hour, that meant 1/5 of a second to dodge a tree, spire, or ridge. Navigation at such heights was nightmarish. At 15,000 feet, a navigator might see 30 miles of terrain. At 100 feet in darkness, visibility shrank to half a mile, distorted by perspective. Gentle hills loomed as cliffs. Church towers seemed to spring from the ground. Flight Sergeant Leonard Sumter, veteran of dozens of low-level raids, likened it to flying blind through a maze of knives. You knew the hazards were everywhere, he recalled, but spotting them before they killed you took something close to clairvoyance. The wireless operator's duties transformed too. Forget listening for recall codes or fighter alerts. His new task was to watch the wings. Wedged into the fuselage where he could see both tips, he shouted constant corrections. Starboard low, port rising. His voice became the pilot's second set of eyes, often the only reason the crew lived to land. More than one Lancaster owed its survival to a wireless operator's split-second warning of unseen power lines or a radio mast looming ahead. Power cables, in fact, were the unseen killers. Germany's electrified railways ran with overhead wires about 20 feet above the tracks, perfect navigation lines, but deadly traps. A pilot following a railway at 100 feet might notice the cables only as its propellers bit through them. Sometimes the aircraft ripped free, trailing live wire like streamers. Sometimes the cables whipped into the engines, tearing them clean off. Flight Lieutenant Bill Reed's crew hit such lines over Holland in November 1943. The impact boomed like a gong through the fuselage. The control column jerked violently, the Lancaster yawing sideways as a port outer engine tore half loose. Reed fought to steady the crippled bomber, limping home with sparks spitting from the nacelle, a reminder that at 100 feet, survival hung by inches and instinct alone. The engine blade sheared away in a spray of metal, one jagged fragment punching through the fuselage and missing the navigator's head by inches. Reed wrestled the Lancaster level, throttled back to reduce structural stress, and somehow limped the crippled bomber back to England. His logbook entry that night was characteristically terse. Turb cables port outer gone. Lucky terrain masking demanded three-dimensional thinking, while racing at 4 miles per minute. A skilled low-level pilot learned to read the land ahead, picking valleys that had aircraft from radar and avoiding commanding heights where flak waited. Flying the Ruhr Valley meant threading between factory chimneys, some 400 feet tall, at twice your altitude with zero margin for error. The pilot's gaze never rested. Altimeter, artificial horizon. The black ahead, altimeter again. Cross-check the airspeed, listen for the navigator, altimeter once more. The psychological strain was relentless and cumulative. High-altitude crews faced terror in concentrated bursts, the cone of searchlights, the flak barrage, a night fighter's cannon salvo. Low-level crews endured grinding stress from the moment they crossed the enemy coast until they were home. No respite, no safe corridor. Every second demanded absolute focus because every second offered a chance for a fatal error. Wing Commander Leonard Cheshire, who pioneered target marking at low level, described the exhaustion as bone-deep and peculiar. After a sortie he would tremble for hours, unable to hold a teacup steady. Constant adrenaline, sustained hypervigilance, and the need for split-second reactions for 3 to 4 hours left marks on men's faces. Photographs of 617 Squadron before and after the dam's raid show the change. The fresh-faced youths of April had become hollow-eyed veterans by June. Training accidents claimed nearly as many lives as operations. Hopgeared crew survived dozens of practice runs only to die on the mission. Others never reached that point. Pilot officer Utley misjudged height over the Scottish hills during training and flew into a slope, killing his whole crew. An acceptable training loss of roughly 2% per month would have provoked outrage in peacetime. In 1943 it was grim arithmetic. Yet men volunteered for low-level units despite the odds. Some craved a skill challenge. Others preferred the swift end of low-level crash to burning in a high-altitude inferno. Many simply believed that extraordinary skill might tilt fate in their favor. Germany's industrial weak point had been visible since 1940, but Allied planners did not capitalize on it until mid-1943. The ride did not run on coal alone. It ran on synthetic fuel. With no oil fields, Germany built a dozen huge hydrogenation plants to convert coal into aviation petrol, diesel, and lubricants via the Fischer-Tropsch process. These sprawling complexes, distillation towers, catalytic converters, storage tanks, were architectural marvels and strategically immobile, impossible to relocate or rebuild quickly. The Luna synthetic oil works near Leipzig embodied the vulnerability. Built by I.G. Farben in the 1920s, Luna produced about 10% of Germany's aviation fuel from a site barely 2 square miles in area. High-altitude bombing in 1942 had hit Luna repeatedly with negligible effect. The intricate network of pipes and reactors shrugged off near misses, which merely created ground between vital installations. Low-level precision offered something different. Reconnaissance showed Luna's critical units, oxygen separators, catalytic converters, the power station, clustered in identifiable buildings. A bomber at 100 feet could place bombs within a 50-yard circle and be almost certain of crippling something essential. Defenses were optimized against high-level attack. Heavy flak batteries ringed complexes at half-mile intervals, radar-directed and lethal to formations at 20,000 feet. Light flak existed, but it was sparse and concentrated around gates and admin blocks rather than the industrial heart. Through spring 1944, planners identified 37 synthetic fuel plants and 7 to 9 vital rail junctions as priority targets. Air Chief Marshal Tedder, Eisenhower's deputy, grasped the logic. Without fuel, the Panzer divisions would stall. Without the rails, they could not redeploy. The dilemma remained. Daylight attacks bled aircraft at 10% losses. Night raids missed by miles. In January 1944, No. 617 Squadron was tasked to devise low-level marking techniques. Leonard Cheshire, now a group captain, proposed a radical fix: send a single mosquito, fast, agile, and hard to hit at low altitude, to mark the target with incendiaries from 100 feet, then bring in heavier bombers at medium height to saturate the marked zone. The mosquito's speed and small profile made it the perfect pathfinder for a doctrine that merits stealth, precision, and daring. The mosquito's small size made it nearly untouchable during its marking run, while the main bomber stream avoided the deadly hazards of ultra-low-level flight in four-engined aircraft. The first full trial came against the Nomade engine plant at Liege on the 8th of February 1944. Cheshire took his Mosquito down to rooftop height in broad daylight, circling the factory as workers scattered, and dropped incendiaries through the skylight of the main assembly hall with surgical precision. The following Lancasters obliterated the target without a single French civilian casualty, an operational success and a propaganda triumph. Within weeks, Bomber Command was adapting the method for night attacks on German soil. The synthetic oil campaign gathered momentum through the spring of 1944. The Luftwaffe, sensing Allied attention on fuel targets, began rationing aviation petrol, a move that only increased the value of each refinery. On the 12th of May, 18 Mosquito from 617 Squadron struck the Wesseling oil refinery near Cologne, using Cheshire's technique. The low-level markers went in first, darting between flak batteries at 50 feet to lay target indicators with pinpoint accuracy. Minutes later, the main force arrived at 8,000 feet and dropped nearly 200 tons of explosives and incendiaries onto an area brilliantly lit from below. Reconnaissance showed catastrophic damage. Distillation towers twisted like wreckage. Storage tanks ablaze for 3 days. Production halted for 6 weeks. The fires, visible from 50 miles away, betrayed the devastation to resistance observers who radioed London detailed reports within hours. Albert Speer would later admit that the concentrated synthetic oil raids after May 1944 crippled Germany more than the entire preceding air campaign. Railway viaducts offered equally valuable precision targets. The Somme railway tunnel in France carried the Paris-Bordeaux main line, vital for German troop movements against the Normandy invasion. On the night of the 8th of June, 1944, 2 days after D-Day, No. 617 Squadron dispatched 19 Lancasters armed with 12,000-pound tallboy bombs capable of punching through 100 feet of rock. Squadron leader Dave Shannon marked the tunnel entrance from 200 feet amid intense flak. The tallboys, released from 8,000 feet, struck with uncanny accuracy and collapsed the tunnel entirely, cutting the line for months. Other targets followed: canal locks, marshalling yards, oil depots, installations that shared one fatal flaw. They were fixed, conspicuous, and impossible to camouflage. A single well-placed bomb through a lock gate could drain a canal section and halt barge traffic for weeks. One destroyed locomotive could block a dozen tracks. Conventional area bombing dispersed power across square miles. Low-level marking concentrated it on square yards. By summer 1940, for the Germans recognized the peril but had no remedy. They could not move oil refineries or shift rail junctions underground, and to ring every target with light flak would have demanded guns and crews urgently needed elsewhere. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm, stretched thin between the eastern front and defense of German cities, could not maintain patrols over every vulnerable site. The arithmetic of survival was grim. In 1942, a Bomber Command crew faced roughly a 3% chance of dying on any single mission. By late 1943, that had risen to 5%, and for low-level specialists it sometimes exceeded 10%. With a standard tour set at 30 sorties, even a 3% loss rate gave a crew only about a 40% chance of completing its tour alive. At 5%, that figure plunged to 21%. Airmen did the math in their barracks, fully aware that 2 of every 3 would be dead, captured, or maimed before their 30th mission. Flight Lieutenant Jack Curry later described the peculiar fatalism that settled over stations after heavy losses. Long-term plans vanished from conversation. No one talked about post-war futures because statistically there wouldn't be one. Instead, talk turned to the immediate. That night's film at the base cinema, tomorrow's pass to the village pub, the taste of bacon at breakfast. The future shrank to hours and days because imagining weeks meant confronting near-certain death. Crew dynamics under such pressure evolved predictably. Bomber crews were intentionally mixing class and temperament. A pilot from a public school flying with a navigator from a Sheffield steel mill, a wireless operator once a bank clerk, a rear gunner from a Glasgow yard. The IAF hoped this diversity would forge a democratic post-war Britain while balancing complementary skills. In reality, it produced 7 men bound tighter than brothers, united by having seen one another almost die countless times. Sergeant Jim Clay, a flight engineer with 106 Squadron, recalled one such night over Essen when flak shredded hydraulics and ignited both inboard engines. The pilot, Flying Officer Thompson, fought the controls for 20 minutes while Clay, soaked in fuel, half blinded by smoke, crawled across the spar trying to keep the bomber alive. Sergeant Clay manually operated the landing gear and flaps with the emergency hand pumps, while the wireless operator, a former fisherman named Muckloud, crawled through the burning fuselage to jettison ammunition before it cooked off. They crash-landed at Manstown with barely 3 feet of runway remaining, the Lancaster's undercarriage collapsing the instant it stopped rolling. No one spoke of it afterward. They had done their jobs, survived by teamwork and skill, and that was enough. Psychological screening for bomber crews was rudimentary by modern standards. A brief interview with a medical officer, a few family questions, a cursory check for neurosis, and you were cleared to fly. The IAF assumed volunteers possessed the necessary resilience and that training would eliminate the unfit. That held until men completed their first tour and faced a choice: volunteer for another, or stand down. Regulations allowed veterans to move into instructor or administrative posts after 30 missions, or leave the service entirely. Yet roughly half of survivors signed up for a second tour. Officially, this was framed as patriotism and duty. Unofficially, it was something darker. Many could not adapt to quiet life after the relentless intensity of operations. Some believed their hard-won expertise, especially in low-level bombing, would be wasted on training grounds. Others simply couldn't abandon their crews, bound by shared trauma and trust. Wing Commander Guy Gibson understood that hesitation at low level meant instant death, and he demanded perfection with severity that bordered on cruelty. During training for the Dams raid, he forced crews through endless practice runs even after perfect scores, pushing them into exhaustion to simulate combat stress. When pilot protested, his answer was always the same: better you hate me now than die next week because you weren't good enough. Gibson drove himself harder than anyone, often flying as an observer on other squadrons' missions to stay sharp. It killed him in the end. His Mosquito exploded over Holland in September 1944, cause unknown. The shadow of lack of moral fiber hung over every station. Any man who refused to fly, feigned illness too often, or displayed visible fear risked being branded LMF, stripped of rank, grounded, and reassigned to humiliating menial work in uniform marked by disgrace. The rule was intended to stop fear from spreading, but it was cruelly indiscriminate, treating a veteran on his 28th operation the same as a rookie on his 3rd. Flight Lieutenant John Searby of 83 Squadron saw it firsthand. One of his navigators, a man who had flown 4 to 6 missions across 2 tours, suddenly broke down, unable to board an aircraft without vomiting uncontrollably. Searby fought to have him discharged medically rather than branded a coward, and succeeded, though the man's name was never cleared. Decades later, historians recognize the symptoms as classic post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition the IAF of 1943 had no vocabulary for. In the absence of formal support, informal brotherhood kept men sane. Veterans coached newcomers on subtleties that no manual mentioned: how to sense when an engine was about to fail, which clouds offered the safest cover, how to read the rhythm of a German searchlight battery. Navigators traded notes about flak concentrations and radar gaps. Ground crews, who worked in freezing hangars and muddy fields, grew fiercely protective of their aircraft and crews, polishing aluminum until it gleamed, convinced that care might bring luck. Letters home became acts of gentle deception. Censorship forbade mention of operations or losses, so men wrote about weather, food, station dances, and requests for socks or cigarettes. They never spoke of the empty bunks multiplying in barracks, or the flaming silhouettes of friends' aircraft tumbling from the night sky. Parents reading cheerful letters had no idea their sons wrote them with trembling hands, the smell of burned oil still in their hair. Germany's response to the low-level onslaught evolved through desperate improvisations that exposed just how deeply their defenses had been outflanked. By autumn 1943, Luftwaffe intelligence fully grasped the threat, British bombers were exploiting radar blind spots and heavy flak weaknesses. The theoretical countermeasure was obvious: develop weapons and detection systems suited to extreme low altitude, but the reality was beyond reach. Industrial strain, fuel shortages, and sheer manpower limits made comprehensive adaptation impossible. Balloon barrages were the first attempt: steel cables suspended from tethered balloons to snare low-flying aircraft. In practice, they were costly, cumbersome, and only marginally effective, another symbol of defense systems scrambling to adapt to an enemy that had learned to fly beneath its reach. The first organized attempt to block low-level approaches to vital sites. The concept wasn't novel. Britain had already used hundreds of barrage balloons to defend London and major ports since 1940, forcing Luftwaffe bombers above 5,000 feet or risk collision with steel cables. Germany copied the method for the Ruhr Valley's industrial core, surrounding synthetic oil refineries, rail yards, and armament factories with balloons tethered at staggered heights. By early 1944, the skies over Essen resembled an airborne maze of more than 800 balloons, an aerial minefield. Initially, the system achieved some success. Several IAF bombers struck cables during approach, the collisions tearing off wings or winding cables around propellers with fatal results. Flight Sergeant Donald McIntosh's Lancaster clipped a balloon cable over Cologne in March 1944, the impact slicing a 6-foot gash in the port wing. Somehow he kept control and limped home to England, landing with empty fuel tanks and hydraulic fluid streaming from the wound. Crews, however, adapted quickly. They began their attack runs from slightly higher levels, dropping to 100 feet only during the final seconds when they could see and dodge balloon clusters. The true flaw in balloon defenses was logistical. Each one needed a crew to operate and maintain it, hundreds of feet of high-grade steel cable, and scarce hydrogen or helium. Protecting a single plant properly could require 200 balloons, and Germany had dozens of such installations. The numbers simply didn't add up. Defenses were spread thin, leaving predictable gaps. Allied reconnaissance easily photographed balloon sites, and attack planners routed missions around them, or waited for windy weather, when German crews had to reel the balloons down to prevent them breaking loose. Expanding light flak seemed more promising. The Luftwaffe 2 cm Flak 38 and 3.7 cm Flak 43 were excellent rapid-fire weapons, capable of throwing dense curtains of shells at low-flying targets. By mid-1944, doctrine called for concentric rings of light flak around priority sites, inner rings at 500 yards, outer at 2,000, forming overlapping fire zones that, in theory, should make low-level raids suicidal. The lunar synthetic fuel works, for instance, bristled with over 60 such positions by June 1944. Yet the statistics told another story. Germany was manufacturing about 20,000 light flak guns a year by 1944, a large figure, but woefully inadequate against competing demands. The Eastern Front consumed weapons at a staggering pace, with Soviet offensives overrunning hundreds of batteries. After D-Day, the Western Front demanded dense flak belts to shield bridges, ports, and supply depots. U-boats required their own anti-aircraft defenses, rail junctions, factories, and transport hubs all clamored for guns. What remained for the oil plants and marshalling yards was never enough. Manpower compounded the problem. Effective light flak operation required trained crews with sharp reflexes, accurate judgment of speed and distance, and the nerve to aim at bombers hurtling straight toward them. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was scraping the bottom of the barrel. Gun crews now included schoolboys of 15 and pensioners of 60. Many were Volkssturm militia or foreign laborers given a few days' instruction before being sent into combat. The guns were excellent, the operators were not. Weather became an unexpected ally for the IAF. Cloud, rain, and industrial haze often cut visibility to a few hundred yards, turning manual flak into blind guesswork. On foggy nights when nothing could be seen below 300 feet, searchlights swept the void to no purpose while bombers crept unseen beneath them, guided by instruments in the Pathfinder Force's new target-marking flares. These colored markers, dropped with precision by low-flying mosquitoes, gave main force crews a visual aiming point even when the ground was invisible. Meanwhile, Germany's once-feared night fighters proved nearly useless at such altitudes. Heavy twin-engine interceptors like the Messerschmitt Bf-110 and Junkers Ju-88 relied on airborne radar to find bombers in darkness, then close visually for attack. But the same ground clutter problem that blinded radar stations also crippled their onboard sets. At 100 feet, the sea of radar echoes from terrain masked the bombers entirely. A night fighter had perhaps a 5% chance of even detecting a Lancaster, and almost none of completing an attack without risking collision with the ground. To compensate, the Luftwaffe adopted wild boar tactics in late 1943. Single-engine fighters such as the Focke-Wulf FW-190 loitered above target zones at medium altitude, using fires and searchlights for illumination, then diving on bombers silhouetted below. The method worked moderately well against high or mid-altitude raids, but failed completely against the new low-level assaults. The British bombers simply appeared without warning, delivered their strikes, and vanished into the dark before German fighters could react. Ghosts beneath the radar horizon. Beneath the fighter patrol altitude. By the time a wild saw pilot glimpsed a low-flying intruder, the bomber had already struck its target and vanished at treetop height where pursuit was suicidal. Acoustic detection offered a theoretical solution. The Riesenrohren Richter, a vast concrete sound mirror, could detect the rumble of aircraft engines over 10 miles away, providing warning when radar failed. The Germans built several around the Ruhr, and they worked precisely as intended. The flaw was timing. By the time operators calculated bearing and range and alerted defenses, the bombers were already halfway to the target. Against high-altitude formations flying predictable routes, this gave minutes of notice. Against low-level raiders moving at 250 miles per hour, it was effectively useless. Perhaps the clearest indicator of defensive collapse lay in Albert Spee's increasingly desperate memoranda through 1944. As armaments minister, he saw the production data firsthand, and the picture was catastrophic. In May 1944, he warned Hitler that synthetic fuel output had fallen 30%. By September, production had plummeted 75%. Spee pleaded for more flak, more fighters, more radar. Hitler approved, but Germany no longer had the resources to deliver. The Reich was losing a war of arithmetic. Allied industry outproduced German capacity tenfold, and no tactical brilliance could reverse that imbalance. The full strategic consequences of low-level bombing crystallized in the summer of 1944 as cumulative effects cascaded through the economy. The synthetic fuel campaign alone forced Spee into impossible trade-offs. Repair bomb refineries or continue tank and aircraft production. He could not do both. By August, aviation fuel rationing had become so severe that Luftwaffe training hours were halved. New pilots reached squadrons with barely 100 hours of flight experience compared to 252 years earlier. They died in droves, facing Allied veterans with 400 to 500 hours in combat. The collapse of transportation compounded every other shortage. When Bomber Command destroyed the Bielefeld Viaduct in March 1945 with 22,000-pound Grand Slam bombs, guided by low-level pathfinders, they didn't just remove a bridge. They severed the Ruhr industrial region from the rest of Germany. Coal couldn't reach power plants, armaments couldn't reach the front, and workers were stranded. That strike symbolized a culmination of a tactical evolution that had begun with a disastrous Augsburg raid 3 years earlier. Germany's dwindling fuel reserves told the same story. At the start of 1944, the Wehrmacht held about 600,000 tons, enough for 3 months of operations. By December, less than 150,000 tons remained. During the Battle of the Bulge, panzer divisions launched their assault with explicit orders to seize Allied fuel dumps, because their own supply couldn't sustain them. When those efforts failed, entire formations stopped cold, tanks abandoned where they stood. The armored spearheads that once terrorized Europe became motionless hulks because bombers flying at 100 feet had crippled the Reich's fuel lifeline months before. The precision made possible by low-level marking transformed the entire air offensive. In 1943, Bomber Command dropped about 157,000 tons of bombs on Germany, of which post-war analysis showed only 20% hit within target zones. In 1944, tonnage rose to 525,000, but accuracy leapt dramatically. With Pathfinder flares placed by low-flying mosquitoes, over 60% of bombs fell within target areas. This wasn't just more destruction, it was a revolution in efficiency. Strategic bombing had evolved from blunt force attrition to pinpoint disruption. The human cost of that precision remained staggering. Bomber Command lost 55,573 men killed, a 44.4% death rate, the highest of any British service. The low-level specialists bore the brunt. Of the 133 aircrew who flew on the Dams raid, 53 died that night and only 45 survived the war. Between 1943 and 1945, 617 squadrons' casualty rate approached 60%, making low-level flying statistically deadlier than serving as an infantryman on D-Day. Yet their innovation reshaped warfare. The principles forged through hardship, precision marking, terrain masking, radar evasion, concentration of force on critical choke points, became the foundation of post-war air doctrine. The U.S. Air Force's Cold War penetration tactics and modern cruise missiles that skim the Earth at 100 feet descend directly from those lessons. Radar still can't track what lies beneath its horizon, and precision still outweighs sheer tonnage. Historians continue to debate the strategic value of bombing. Arthur Harris maintained until his death that area bombing alone could have won the war with sufficient resources. Critics argue it was an immense waste, achieving little beyond what ground offensive secured. But the low-level precision campaign stands apart because its results were measurable and decisive. German fuel production didn't erode gradually, it collapsed in lockstep with the refinery attacks. Transport networks didn't crumble from attrition. They failed at precise choke points bombed into oblivion. The men who flew at 100 feet weren't pondering strategy as they hurtled through tracer and flak. They thought only of their altimeter, their target, their navigator's voice, and whether they'd make it home. Flight Lieutenant Bill Reed, shot down after a low-level strike on Dusseldorf, later said he never felt heroic, just terrified, focused, and reliant on his crew, aware that survival was partly luck. The final accounting is impossible because not every victory shows in tonnage graphs or production charts. Every German fighter grounded for lack of fuel meant one bomber crew that lived. Every tank immobilized by fuel shortage meant one town spared destruction. Those young men climbed into Lancasters knowing the odds, not because they sought death, but because they believed precision could shorten the war and save lives. Flying at 100 feet was the price of that precision. History suggests the calculation was correct, though that truth offers cold comfort to the 55,000 who never returned. Their courage ended the war sooner. Their innovation changed how all wars since have been fought, and that, ultimately, was the point.